be looking at issues of whether censorship is something that we should really be worried about in our museums in the UK, abroad, if controversy is a bad thing, a good thing, and what, if anything, we should be doing to protect our freedom of speech in museums. It is a topical debate. Politics in this country and abroad has rarely been more febrile, and tomorrow's vote in America is certainly an example of that. Sensitivities around what is and what is not permissible in the public arena are heightened as never before. And on campuses, we see the growth of the idea of safe spaces, free from unwanted ideas and unwanted behaviors, just at the same time as we see in museums a sector that is supposedly trying to encourage debate and a range of interesting and diverse views in the sector. So the way that we present collections, the way that we engage with the public, the language that we use, all that is up for debate. And sometimes we find ourselves under pressure to change our work, even against our will. I'm joined today by an esteemed and expert group to discuss some of these issues and how we as a sector should be responding to them and perhaps standing up for ourselves. I'm joined by Julia Farrington, Associate Producer at the Index on Censorship, and the woman behind a series of guides that you can find on the Index on Censorship website, which are absolutely wonderful publications that tell you more or less everything you need to know on the legal and ethical issues around censorship. We have Nathaniel Hepburn, Director of Ditchling Museum of Art and Craft, and who is looking to deal with the extremely difficult legacy in his museum of the artist Eric Gill. And last but not least, Janet Marstine, Director of Studies at the University of Leicester Museum Studies School, and also a long-standing member of the Ethics Committee at the Museums Association. I wanted to start off today by asking each of you in turn really to think about what we actually mean when we talk about censorship in the first place, because I think that we have a tendency to think about censorship as something that happens elsewhere in tin pot dictatorships and things, but what does it actually mean in a UK setting? Julia, maybe you could start.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here to speak and to be part of this very impressive conference. Freedom of expression, looking at life, if you like, through the lens of freedom of expression is always very edifying, because I think it's giving you a very clear analysis of who has power and who does not have power in any given sort of freedom of expression incidents or conversation, whatever it is. It's just it's a good way of looking at who is speaking to who and how about what. And similarly in censorship, with risking the oversimplification, if you're looking at the censorship of artwork, in the case of state-sponsored censorship, which it is worth looking at, because I think it's what we mostly associate with censorship, we see a deliberate act of silencing, usually upheld by a clear miscarriage of justice and violation of rights by a tyrannical or at least authoritarian power. In the sense, when we're looking at self-censorship, in the work that I've done a lot of in the UK, it takes us usually into the spaces that many artists are naturally attracted to, the unspoken, the taboo-ridden, the contested spaces in society, often characterized by polarized opinions, offense, abuse, prejudice, injustice. I think censorship thrives on fear of the consequences of speaking out. This works for classic state-sponsored censorship, as it does for self-censorship. The penalties are going to be very different according to where the censorship happens, but I think fear is the big player. In the state-sponsored scenario, fear of imprisonment and worse, torture and possibly even loss of life figures large. Here the penalties will be softer but still effectively deter people from speaking out. It could be the fear of hostile media or public response, being shot down in flames in social media, causing offense, the fear of prosecution, possibly ill-founded, or of the police knocking on the door of your gallery, reputational damage, damaging funding relationships, fear of speaking out against the message of the institution. So the artists and arts managers that in my work at Index I've had the privilege to meet are people who have, in the large, overcome that fear, the fear that keeps others silent, and going into places that are difficult to speak truth to power. And that has been a huge inspiration to me personally. I don't work in a museum, although I am very, very delighted to be working with Nathaniel on the project at Ditchling. But I'm actually going to look at the world of theatre for a moment. I've been working for the last 2.5 years with Belarus Free Theatre. They are interesting in this context because they come from Belarus, where there is a dictatorship, known as the last dictatorship in Europe. And they have experience of living and working under this government that does ban them. They are an illegal organization, and they're forced to operate underground. Because of their political activities, the artistic directors are now political refugees here in the UK, and the company has an associate. It's an associate of the Young Vic Theatre. So they have great visibility, they tour the world, they get awards here in this country and internationally, whilst in their own country they are subject to raids, they're constantly being moved on by the authorities. They have no space to call their own, they're not allowed to advertise their shows. And yet they admit to feeling artistically freer to express themselves in Belarus than they do here, because everything they do is banned. Where there are no rights, there are no responsibilities. They are as likely to be raided by the KGB, which is the name given to the police force there still, for a mimed performance of the seagull, as they are for an excoriating attack on human rights abuses perpetrated by the president. Of course, they feel infinitely safer here. And by the way, they love the country, and they appreciate their other freedoms of assembly and of movement, although that might be a bit more problematic in years to come. Anyway, and yet here in the UK, they feel with the aliveness of frogs jumping into boiling water that the space for expression is tied up with tripwires and limitations that they were not expecting. What I like about them is that they continue to shake the cage here too. They see with the clarity of the outsider what we know ourselves to be true, that we take our rights for granted and carry the burden of responsibility, possibly to the detriment of fighting for our rights. I think it needs to be reassessed, that we have to review the contract between rights and responsibilities and ask if we were giving away too much, and that as a result, the size of the space for freedom of expression is contracting. Our responsibilities are multiple, and all of them come with a certain pressure to control what we say or how free we feel. We have responsibilities to our audience, to our funders, to the Charity Commission that is so uneasy about art speaking directly to politics, to health and safety concerns, to risk-averse boards. And when the police come into a gallery exhibiting Mims's ISIS Threatened Sylvania, I don't know whether you're aware of that happened almost a year ago now, in the Mall Galleries in London, and asks for £36,000 to guarantee the safe presentation of the work, then that sends out a chill across the sector that is as effectively communicated as a press release from the Metropolitan Police saying that freedom of expression comes at a price, and yet the sector doesn't fight back. Belarus Free Theatre's new production, Burning Doors, features the work of Pussy Riot, who I'm sure you've all heard of, and maybe the less-known Piotr Pawlenski, a Russian actionist, who is most famous for nailing his scrotum to the cobblestones of Red Square, a gesture against the complacency and apathy of the Russian people. It also featured the story of Oleg Sentsov, a Ukrainian filmmaker currently from the Crimea, currently serving a 20-year sentence on terrorist charges for crimes he didn't commit. He has been tortured. And the last 20 minutes of the play sees each of the performers coming up against their physical limits. I think this is the metaphor for all of us. We need to have as much resilience to fight to keep our freedoms as those who are fighting to win theirs. I think some of the intensity in the performance comes from the experience of living and working underground, but some comes from a kind of desperation that the artistic directors who directed this play feel about the complacency and apathy they've encountered in this country. A real use it or lose it message. I'm very excited to be working with Nathaniel on the project that he will be telling you about in a minute. In our first meeting, he said that he believes public institutions have to take the lead in taking on society's difficult subjects. But if you are going to do that, and to create the conditions in which a difficult and divisive debate can take place, then it does take additional resources. It has to be very carefully managed. which is something, again, the staff and Ditchling is committed to doing. So I think it is that willingness to confront your own reservations, your own fear of the subject matter and its enormity, and to take it on as a public institution. Thank you.
Fantastic. Lots to chew on there, and natural that we should move to Nathaniel. Do we take our rights for granted in the UK? What's your experience at Ditchling?
So in terms of censorship for us, nobody has ever said, don't deal with this subject. It has been something we've imposed on ourselves. We're a small independent museum in rural Sussex, about 45 minutes away from London, just near Brighton. The museum went through a major redevelopment in 2014, became Museum of the Year finalist, REBA Building of the Year. It was a real change from being a local history museum to being a museum and art gallery telling the story of a community of artists, including David Jones, the calligrapher Edward Johnston, Frank Branwyn, and many others, including Eric Gill. And he was really the centerpiece for the reason that many of these artists came to the village. And in 1989, Fiona McCarthy's biography of Gill revealed that he had incestuous relationships with two of his sisters. He'd experimented sexually with his dog, and he had sexually abused two of his daughters. And this was a story that had been, we all know, we don't know how many of our visitors who come through the museum know that. We don't know that at the moment. But to most people walking through the museum, we didn't talk about it. We showed the work, but we didn't talk about it. We talked about it behind the doors, and if people wanted to know, we talked about it. But to most visitors, there wasn't anything visible. So I have to come clear that we're talking about being brave, and we've yet to do anything. You're still, if you walked around the museum today, wouldn't come across anything to tell you this story. One of the main reasons that I was sitting in a museums conference 2 years ago, and Kim Thomas from BBC was talking about a programme that they had done, a casualty storyline about female genital mutilation. And she said, as a public institution, we have a right to deal with these difficult subjects. And we have the trust in our organisations that mean we're the right people to deal with these difficult subjects. And I just sat in the room going, okay, we've got this really difficult subject and we're not dealing with it. And if we want to be an organisation that's socially responsible and to do some programming around that, then we've got to confront this issue somehow. It also feels like a time bomb that's just ticking away, and one day the Daily Mail will turn up and run a piece. And in fact, just last week, our local newspaper did do a piece, not directly associated to us, but that required managing. And then it will be someone else telling that story, not us. It will be somebody else coming from a very incendiary position and not a thoughtful, considered, meditative kind of process. I'm also very aware of the dishonesty that we have to our visitor when we're not engaging with that. So as you walk around the museum, you might be confronted with a beautiful wood engraving of a woman climbing out of the bath, and it's a beautiful work. And if you don't know that that's Gill's daughter around the time he was abusing her, then when you go home and you study that, what do you feel? Some sort of kind of complicitness in that process from not having understood how you were viewing that work. And then there's the self-censorship. There's whole areas of Gill's work that we just can't show, won't show, because we haven't done the work, because we're not brave enough to show it, and we don't have the language to articulate the work. We just don't understand what that will mean to our audiences to show it. So there is some self-censorship that we do that. And then I saw you were clutching a copy of the MA Code of Ethics there, and I was flicking through, can I borrow it for a second? Thank you. I haven't got mine with me, sorry, Alistair. I usually carry it, but public engagement and public benefit. Museums and those who work in it should actively engage and work in partnership, reach out to new audiences, fine. Treat everyone equally with honesty and respect. If you show an object and you don't explain everything you know about it, then I just don't think we're treating our visitors with honesty and respect if we do that. Museums should provide and generate accurate information for and with the public. Sort of don't do that. Support freedom of speech and debate. Really are not doing that. Using collections for public benefit, for learning, inspiration, and enjoyment. We're doing that, but for public benefit, what's our kind of social responsibility in that? So there was a sense that actually we were kind of failing in some of our code of ethics. So one of the strands for the conference is being brave. I think it's probably more accurate to describe it as being terrified. For us, as this tiny museum, we don't get any public revenue funding. We're reliant on our gate receipts and our earned income and our relationships with our funders. To confront this issue is terrifying for our volunteers who have to have those conversations with the people walking through the door. And all of that requires, we are nervous approaching the subject and going through it. And actually to own that and be terrified is actually quite liberating, and it allows us to kind of go through those steps. And we've gone through the process, and we are going through the process really slowly. The first thing was I contributed to an article in the art newspaper on these issues of self-censorship and just kind of put out there that we were worried that we weren't doing it and we were going to start a process of talking about this. And you kind of put it out there and you're terrified of what's going to happen. Is it going to go viral on social media and people do all sorts of slam us down? You kind of wait, nothing happens. I hosted a Monday Museums Hour Twitter discussion about dealing with difficult issues. You kind of put yours out there and kind of wait and see whether there's a storm of objection, and there wasn't. And then we had a workshop day just last week before last, where we invited museum professionals and academics and others into the museum to talk through some of the objects that we have, to test them against their own feelings, their own responses to these objects and the stories behind them, to test through some kind of really everyday ethical issues we have about image licensing, who we license our images to, and kind of retail decisions that are all tied up in how we look at Eric Gill. And then to test some of our potential programming ideas and engagement ideas as well. And to really test that and build around us a support network. And that's been really very important for us. We're strengthening our board. We know that, if the Daily Mail turns out on the village green wanting to talk to me, I'd quite like some of my trustees who are there to know their stuff and can really support us in making this stance as well. Talking to our stakeholders, whether that's funders, whether that's local partners, and building those partnerships around us so that hopefully we can soon have a really very open public debate. We're talking with organisations who work with survivors of sexual abuse as well, to talk to them about what it might mean for us to do this sort of programming, how they might or might not want to be involved. And soon, I think probably over the next 6 months and a year, we'll have some programming as well as some elements of our interpretation that are explicitly engaging with something we find really difficult, and there is no definitive straight Daily Mail headline narrative to it.
Fantastic. So you're working tentatively towards this subject that you have quite a lot of fear and trepidation about. You've also decided that you're not working ethically. We'll have to haul you in front of Janet, who's on the ethics committee. Janet, what do you make of this sort of tension between? We've heard something about some domestic views on censorship and self-censorship. We've heard something about international censorship and Julia's work in Belarus. What's your take? Because you've done some work in China and Hong Kong as well as in the UK and Europe.
Yes, so I have a 3-year British Academy grant to look at censorship and self-censorship in Hong Kong and Guangdong. And particularly in art spaces. And while my primary interest is in this region, of course, we do this work also so that we can shine the mirror on ourselves and to understand these things within a UK perspective as well. I started off with the project assuming that in mainland China, that censorship would primarily be something that comes from the state. And in Hong Kong, it would primarily be softer or self-censorship coming from market pressures. But my assumptions were challenged in all kinds of interesting ways. So part of that comes from a very changing political landscape over the 3-year, really 4-year period since we applied for the grant. I have a partner at Chinese University Hong Kong who's really helped me to understand this landscape, Oscar Ho. And when we applied for the grant, for example, the umbrella movement hadn't occurred yet. So all kinds of really seismic changes in Hong Kong as well as in China. And what I would say is that the thing that I found most is a kind of slipperiness between the two. So clearly it will be next year in 2017, it will be 20 years since the handover and the one country, two systems was established. But as that anniversary comes closer and closer, the political tensions get stronger and stronger. And at the same time, there's a greater and greater slipperiness between censorship and self-censorship. So for example, in China, in mainland China, there are many, many business interests as well, which create self-censorship. And censorship in and of itself doesn't operate without those fears of self-censorship. Certainly in mainland China, censorship is a much more seamless thing. And in fact, I can't even do my research there without self-censoring. So I don't use that word censorship with a capital C. Instead, I use language such as curatorial silences, or language such as curatorial autonomy or curatorial integrity. What I found, however, is that in fact, those things are much more important than that censorship word with a capital C, and that many of the people that I've interviewed and spoke with about my initial research, and we're still kind of midway through the process, have been particularly encouraging of the fact that I'm not simply dismissing the really important work that they do with that capital C of censorship. But in fact, what's become most interesting to me is the ways that that practitioners and artists engage very creatively within those very strong limits. I've also come to see that even the word censorship in a Chinese context has very, very painful associations. So for example, it is oftentimes associated with this idea of self-criticism that comes with the politics of socialism, and so oftentimes they'll use the word approval process in a kind of more positive spin, that the word censorship in itself is so difficult, is so painful. So I've had to kind of negotiate some of these things while also I'm vetted and censored myself, and also understand how, you know, the reality that there are minders in many Chinese museums, and that in fact this is something that practitioners in China deal with, you know, on a very everyday basis. At the same time, in Hong Kong, there is more and more censorship. In some ways, we might even call it state censorship going on, with pressure from mainland China in terms of what can and can't be seen, and also stronger self-censorship that's occurring in anticipation of what China might or might not want to see. So it's very, very complex. And I would say along with that, a very, in Hong Kong, because of real estate the way it is, there isn't much public space in any case that's truly public space, but more and more of an erosion of that, which is particularly problematic. And with this work that I'm doing, I still have to stand back and say that the creative work that's being done is just amazing in terms of creating alliances, in terms of understanding, for example, and anticipating some of the seasonal and locational tensions around. So, for example, around the anniversary of the massacre of Tiananmen Square, that would not be a time when you'd want to do a project that might be pushing boundaries. Or you might know that Guangzhou might be freer in some ways in the south than Beijing, which is the capital. So understanding what some of those, what some of those strategies might be. Also thinking about, in some ways, what when self-censorship might be ethical. So when do you really realize that the risks for yourself and for others are too important to move ahead with the project? Or maybe you think about the long term instead of the short term. So maybe things won't change in your generation, or maybe you're thinking about soft, very subtle changes, but thinking about something that might happen over your lifetime or into the next generation. So that's how I oftentimes hear Hong Kongers speak, for example, now. Also thinking about small pockets of freedom within larger organizations. So when I came in and started talking with informants, for example, I had imagined that smaller organizations might have possibility for greater freedom. But in fact, oftentimes it's those very large organizations where the hierarchy is so obtuse and it's almost impossible to control fully, and so small pockets within that. So hearing these stories, thinking about ways that people work, has been very, fascinating to me, and also thinking about the way that we in the UK might also be complicit in some of this is very important too. So what is our responsibility in the UK towards Hong Kong is a very interesting point. So very much work in progress, but absolutely thinking about those slipperiness, that slipperiness between censorship and self-censorship.
Very interesting. I'm struck, first off, by the tension here between the curatorial process and the creative process. So you talked a bit about the fantastic visual art that's being created in Hong Kong and China, and that's also being used to push boundaries and to challenge. And that's a very different position to be in than the position of a curator, someone in Nathaniel's position who's having to make a sort of gatekeeper decision about what you do and don't want your audience to see, or what you do and don't reveal to your audience. Do you feel comfortable with the idea of being a gatekeeper and taking on that responsibility?
I would like to think that there isn't anything in our museum collection that we wouldn't show with the right interpretation around it, with the right trigger warnings that might be needed, or without the right context, that anything in our collection should be able to be shown. So it's not necessarily about the gatekeeping to the collection, and I think we have been gatekeeping because we haven't done the work that we need to do to have those open discussions. So I'd like to think that the process we're going through is to stop us from being from gatekeeping in any other way than a normal curatorial decision. A curatorial decision that's made out of fear of press backlash, fear of legal situations, fear of audience upsetting your audience. I think that's the self-censorship we want to kind of move away from.
That kind of, you have this, again, you have that balance between, you have a sense of responsibility to do something about the difficult story that you've got to tell, and then you have this fear of what happens when you do it. And your process is about overcoming that fear. Do you have any advice for people here about how to go through that process? I know that, again, it's a work in progress.
It is a work in progress. Yes, the balance is between a kind of social and moral and ethical position about what a museum should be, and making sure I don't bankrupt the organisation. We're reliant on our gate receipts, we're reliant on our footfall. 3 months or a week or two of, no visitors because we've done it wrong, we've upset people, we've got the process wrong, is hugely damaging for our organisation. So that's the balance. So the process is, what are all the risks, and how can we minimise those risks? And are there opportunities that we can make which means that those risks can be minimised?
One of the things in talking with artists and curators in Hong Kong and China, and also speaking with practitioners here in the UK, that's become clear to me is that I really see that negotiating these difficult issues is absolutely central to curatorial practice, to all of our curatorial practice. And I would probably extend that also beyond curatorial practice to thinking about what learning officers have to do as well, and thinking about museum directors, that negotiating these things, thinking creatively, thinking about language, for example, all of these things are really important. It's central to our self-reflective practice. And so this is one of the key skills that we need to be thinking about. So, so in fact, Nathaniel shouldn't feel like he's isolated here. That in fact, this is something that so many of us are going through. And if we were able to talk about this more openly, and more of us were able to be brave like you are, then in fact, those alliances would be really helpful. In empowering and giving agency to the larger sector in doing this kind of work.
Do you think that we're on a road to building that kind of language? Do you think that we're able to speak about controversial, difficult issues more openly now? I mean, I liked your distinction earlier between censorship and approval process, and I feel like actually we've built a lot of the way that we manage museum collections, museum displays, as being kind of it's all built into our own processes in our own museums here in the UK. Do we already actually have a language that builds censorship into what we do?
I think that many of us are in denial. That in fact, when I talk to people around the UK, and you probably have a very similar experience, that it's very easy for practitioners to say, not me, not here, this happens somewhere else. That it's very easy to be in denial about these things. And I think that sometimes identifying the pressures of self-censorship is one of the most important skills in this work. I also think that as financial pressures continue to increase and more of us think about other kinds of funders, whether it's corporate funders, whether it's funders from, from other nations or whatever, there can be all kinds of other kinds of pressures that are on us that we need to think about. So I think those boundaries are fuzzier. We tend to think that censorship happens only in, in relation to state censorship and this idea of freedom somehow. There is never quite such a thing. And even thinking, unpacking the question of what's the relationship between good professional editing and self-censorship is a very difficult issue. The way we use language to describe even certain issues about identity politics, and how this is being sensitive and respectful, or how might it become such an issue that we're afraid to say some things. There's so many gray areas here, and I think identifying where we're self-censoring, how we're self-censoring, is absolutely central to the larger project.
Yeah, I mean, I've done quite a lot of work looking at self-censorship, and actually I haven't encountered anyone who's been in denial at all, funnily enough. I think that people do admit to it. I had some quite high-level roundtables. It was all sort of Chatham House, but there was no one questioning that core idea that self-censorship is pervasive and an increasingly problematic thing that people were really keen to talk about. And I think that what's really important, like what you were saying, it's actually about being able to analyze and identify those pressures. And and there's all sorts of ways of looking at censorship, and some people really like getting involved in the sort of the debate about whether one kind of expression is right or wrong and whether it should or shouldn't. But what I'm really interested in, looking at the interrelationship of institutions and how we create a space in which freedom of expression thrives. In other words, what are the conditions for freedom of expression to thrive? And I'm very interested, for instance, in the police, because the police have recently demonstrated that when there has been protest associated with artwork, which we've had a series of things. We did have, obviously, the Exhibit B, which was produced by the Barbican, and we've had something that was shut down in Edinburgh. And, there's a sort of, there aren't very many incidents, and this thing at the Mall Gallery as well, where the police were involved. But they carry such huge weight and communicate across the sector very powerfully. And so, in fact, at Index, we've actually taken up the issue, and in fact the Arts Council has been very helpful in taking the issue with us to the Crown Prosecution Service, because there's some really quite major inconsistencies in how the police manage the public space around artwork, and there's some big inconsistencies. There's a problem with the language. The language is very much that they advise you to close, when in fact, if you don't, you really do risk arrest. So, there's some problem. It's a sort of Hobson choice. So there's sort of important work to do and in fact, Alison Saunders recognises that it's important work to do. So I think that is an institution that we can be talking to as part of this. And I also think that the Charity Commission, it's not something I know a huge about, but I think it is used a lot as a reason not to do things. We can't do that because of our charitable status. And I think that the idea that sort of work that engages directly with political issues is somehow beyond the pale is kind of crazy. And if artists and arts institutions feel gagged by that, then I think that's a big problem. And I would, sort of like something I would like to get more into, because that is something you hear. And I think it's being used as a screen. So it's sort of...
You think that people are saying we can't do this because the Charity Commission says so?
Yeah. That's something I've heard, and it's not something I haven't done a huge amount of work on. But
and Nathaniel, it sounds like you've done quite a lot of work to bring your board, your governors with you, your trustees. It seems like that's also been a really important part of your process, and actually quite a lot of the examples of censorship that we hear about in the UK, at any rate, come from the governors, whether that is a local authority or a charitable organisation. Is that kind of a bit of a blind spot for us at the moment in terms of thinking about censorship?
I think one of the important processes was realising or establishing what was making us nervous about the process. Why were we not doing this? And there's elements about not having the right language to talk about it, whether you're talking about victims of sexual abuse or survivors of sexual abuse or people who have been abused. There's language there that I have never encountered. It's not an area I work in, so you have to learn and understand how to talk. There are areas of, if we're worried about how the press is going to deal with the story, we need expert advice, and whether we need that on the board or elsewhere. But absolutely, it was about identifying what was making us nervous and putting in place protection for that. So yes, making sure that we've got really good legal advice on our board or elsewhere, making sure we've got really good press and PR management advice, but also that the board and the organisation generally believes in what we're doing and why we're doing it. So we're not doing it just sort of accidentally. There's a real passion behind it, a belief that it's the right thing to do, and we can articulate that, that message.
And at the same time, I would also say it's important to note the fact that there is some fantastic work going on in terms of discussing difficult issues. Some really fantastic work going on. So it's important to note that, and at the same time acknowledge that there's a difference, you know, so there are different kinds of controversies. So there is controversy that's intended primarily to shock, and there's controversy which is intended to create, you know, some kind of mutual understanding, some kind of deeper understanding. And so I think understanding the difference between those things is really helpful, and recognizing what good work there is out there, and also some new really excellent scholarship on this as well.
So is there good controversy and bad controversy then?
Absolutely. I wouldn't say it's bad controversy, but there's controversy that doesn't really have any larger aims beyond just, you know, that kind of, you know, larger kind of shock value and attention. And there's controversy where there's, you know, where there's a larger social aim. And so understanding that difference, I think, is really important.
And there are some examples that I'm sure we can all think of where museums have gone for the quote-unquote bad controversy just to get a bit of shock value and a bit of press, whereas there are other types that have been better and deserved more attention.
I would say so. And then there's a lot in between where museums may be trying to do it, but some haven't quite developed that language yet, and they're working towards that. So I'd say there's a wide spectrum of activity.
So earlier we had a sort of difference in opinion. You said that you didn't find anybody who thinks that self-censorship and censorship isn't going on. You said that actually people were a little bit in denial about it. I want to test that. So I want you all to get your apps out because we're going to try out some new the new technology. I'm just coming over here for my clicker just to show you what to do here. So if you all go to the session in your app, should be in your agenda. If you go there, you'll find that there are 3 buttons on your phones. They'll be at the top of the screen, but one for feedback and the one probably furthest on the right should be a voting one. So if you all go to your voting section in your app, then you should have a series of questions, simple yes/no questions that you can answer in the app. And what I'd like you to do over the next 5 minutes or so is just have a look at these questions and think about them and respond. So we've got, have you ever withheld an object or a collection from display in order to protect your organization or your visitors? And that's sort of the situation that Nathaniel finds himself in at Ditchling Museum. We've got, have you ever consciously withheld information from audiences due to its controversial nature? And then finally, kind of more directly, have you ever suffered external political interference in your museum's exhibitions or programming? And I mean that in the broadest sense of political interference. I don't mean that as in, did the culture minister come in and tell you not to say or do something? I mean, have councillors, have governors come in and told you explicitly not to do something that you curatorially or artistically wanted to do and felt justified in doing? So have a look at that. We will take some questions from the floor just now, and we will come back to this at the end and find out just how real censorship in museums is. So with that, I want to open up questions to the floor. I'm sure that people do have questions, but maybe they need a bit of... Oh, and if you do want to ask a question, then you'll need to come to one of the microphone stands here, here, and here. Yes, we've got one here.
So I'm Chris, I'm from the organisation Art Not Oil, and we campaign on oil sponsorship.
Can you speak up a bit?
Yeah, sure. I was interested as to whether there's a counterpart here, the issues of transparency and accountability. So firstly, in some cases, identifying those times where censorship and self-censorship have actually taken place is a challenge in itself. So how do we identify that? How are those processes made accountable to the public as well? And then what are the instruments or devices for ensuring that there is that accountability, whether that is the Code of Ethics from the Museums Association or whether institutions, particularly on the issue of sponsorship, need to have ethical fundraising policies or other kinds of policy that ensure that these decisions are being made in that accountable way that can be scrutinized effectively.
How do museums ensure that they themselves are transparent and are not making decisions that they oughtn't be making?
I think it's a really good question. I think that what tends to happen when there is a controversy, the doors tend to shut. And that's a real pity, and very often also that the work is removed or the provocation is removed. That's not answering all your questions, it's just looking at the last part of it. And I think that when an artist has created a piece of work that is perhaps one of the coming from the good controversy place, they actually want a debate. They want it to trigger a debate. And if the debate gets a little bit too heated, then there is a tendency to remove it and to sort of go behind the scenes and decide what to do next. And I think that that's a real pity, because that's when you're missing, in effect, the real value and the real power of the artwork. So I think if that institution actually sees the controversy as integral to the artwork, holds on to the bumpy ride, and is able to keep that as an open and public discussion about the controversy, I think that would be one way of keeping that space open.
Janet, the Ethics Committee's talked quite a lot about this, hasn't it?
Well, I would say also that this really goes beyond the realm of art. And so there are so many areas where we might think about the overlap between censorship and self-censorship and what could potentially be, not giving full accountability or transparency. For example, with provenance issues, where oftentimes there are certain things that are hidden. There are so many other kinds of hidden areas of museum work where we don't declare sometimes because of murky histories or difficult moments or offending or potentially offending others. And so one of the things that the MA new code suggests is potentially that museums might have their own ethics working group. How that happens, we're not quite sure, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And this is different. I mean, of course, how this ethics working group might function is very much open to question, because obviously if it's hierarchical and one feels that one is reporting to a director or a line manager or something like that, rather than working with colleagues in conjunction to unpick an issue, then it's going to be not very helpful. But how might we create kind of working groups then to work through and think about these difficult issues and all those permutations? So I see, rather than the ethics committee or someone else policing from outside, that this has to come from inside. And creating alliances, whether it's a working group within your institution, or if you're in a small institution, working across with other colleagues from other institutions. But I think it really has to come more internally rather than externally.
Right. We've got another question here.
I'm just going to shout. Is that okay? Can you hear that?
We've got people online, so you've got to go to the mic. Yeah. Sorry, Nat.
It's a sort of question by means of an anecdote. I don't know, this is anecdotal, but in Glasgow there's museums like St Mungo's Museum, the People's Palace, Gallery of Modern Art, which have been quite brave and have been the subject of protests about content that they've put in. And they've broken taboos and they've consciously made a decision not to self-censor. And Glasgow, as we've heard earlier, is a place where funding for museums and funding for the arts is quite healthy, and there's a lot of political support and so on. And I just wondered, does anybody know of any evidence or any correlation at all that museums who avoid difficult subjects and avoid getting into trouble, get treated beneficially? Because I certainly don't see it. And actually, it's often the institutions who are prepared to be brave who are the ones who get all the funding. So in fact, isn't it in our interest just to show a little bit of that? But maybe I'm wrong.
Interesting. Is it better to be safe or controversial?
I hope very much that in the long term it is better to be open and brave. And, the funders that we talk to are supportive of us having an honest, open, kind of progressive dialogue with our visitors. In the short term, if I wanted to do an exhibition of Eric Gill, and I talked to my commercial sponsors and said, which I have done, I've talked to some commercial sponsors about supporting major loans of Gill's work. They kind of look at me, you know what he did, yeah? We're not going to put our name next to that. Whereas, if I could as easily do a Henry Moore sculpture and I'd have all of my commercial sponsors kind of lined up ready to support it. So short term, it might be more painful. Long term, I hope that, the bravery does pay off financially as well.
Do we have anyone else? Yes, we've got another one here.
Hello. Oh, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I just wondered, you've talked a bit about having to sort of get your trustees to support you in this. I just wondered if you had any opposition from below. You talked mentioned briefly you had volunteers working for you. I just wonder if they have had any opposition to tackling this issue, and if you've had to get their buy-in, and if so, how?
So, were your volunteers going along with or opposed to your work?
Conscious that probably all my team are sitting watching this live stream back at work. Not so much volunteers, because we're probably not at that point in our journey yet. But with our staff, the team are all approach it with their own nervousness. It's new ground. Some of them have been dealing with this on their own for a long time, and that's difficult. And we spend a lot of time just talking about it and talking about it internally, and just really acknowledging that it's difficult for all of us to deal with this. These are works of art that we really love. Eric Gill is an extraordinary artist. We probably wouldn't be doing the project if he weren't. He's an extraordinary artist. They're very seductively beautiful, powerful works. And he is a man, or that particular bit of his work, of his personality, is abhorrent, and we hate it. And actually being able to articulate that and going, he's a great artist, a horrid, horrendous man who did horrendous things, is actually also quite useful to kind of really be open in that area. But there's a lot of process of not necessarily bringing people with me, but just kind of going together on that process. And also, as I say, knowing why we're doing it. Keeping going back to going, why are we doing this? Because we could not, but what's the motivation behind it?
So, time is marching on. I hope you've all been voting, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to check out some results. There we go. So, have you ever withheld an object or a collection from display in order to protect your organisation or your visitors? Yes. We're pretty much neck and neck, actually. This looks like the EU referendum. We've basically got 48% and 52%. But that's actually quite high. I'm quite surprised about that.
there's a hidden museum there, isn't there? All of those objects that are sitting in people's storerooms that they don't ever want to share is interesting.
What about the next one? Do we have a next one? Oh. Yeah, we're on our way. There we go. Have you ever consciously withheld information from audiences due to its controversial nature? A whopping 51.5%. Again, so we seem to have...
neck and neck.
We've been neck and neck again. And the final one? Have you ever suffered external political interference in your museum's exhibitions or programming? Here, slightly more marked 55% saying yes, to less than 45% saying no. Again, any brief reactions? We've got about a minute to go.
Brief reactions. Yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in that. It makes me think that the collections are much more various than we might sort of easily think. And how interesting? What is it? I'm just curious. What is not being said? It's a very, very compelling question for me.
Nathaniel, a couple of final words.
I think that's really fascinating that there is that kind of hidden museum, that treasure trove of museums that people are not prepared to show, or that the political influence around them is not allowing them to show. I think there's a lot more work to be done there that could be very, very interesting.
And Janet?
And what I wish is that we had the whole rest of the day to make this into a safe space for us to share this with one another and imagine strategies to move forward. Because wouldn't that be a great thing to do in the future, to think about how to deal with this?
And that is something that obviously the Ethics Committee at the Museums Association can help with, in having those conversations behind closed doors, but a sounding board to help make some of those difficult decisions.
Yes.
Well, we're out of time. I want to thank the panel and thank particularly the app company for their polling software. And you're free to go. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks.